Just before we kick off with the interesting content, just a couple of house rules for the Zoom session. If you can please remain on mute throughout the presentations. All of the participants are encouraged to post questions in the chat bar. You can do this for both the speakers' presentations and also for the panel discussion, or if you have broader questions that you want to bring to the focus of the group. We will be piloting, for us at least today, the whiteboard application mural. This will be an opportunity for the group to brainstorm and to share their views on what is needed to scale up investment in resilient infrastructure in Asia and the Pacific. In the chat bar, you will find a link to the mural whiteboard. You can download that now or when we come back to that session later on. In case you're worrying about gathering notes from today's session, we will share all the presentations and the resources from this event with the participants after the session. So we're interested to find out who our participants are today. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sugar, who is Gonzalez, who works with us here at the SDCD team at ADB, and she will introduce to you a participant poll. Sugar, please.
Thanks, Noel. I'm showing now the poll, so everyone is encouraged to answer. And yeah, we'll give you about 30 seconds to answer. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got about 80% reply, and so our representation today includes government agencies from across the ADB member countries, also some representatives from private sector in the ADB developing countries, and lots of ADB staff and groups of others. So thank you for that. I think we'll end the polling there. Our first presentation today is titled ADB Perspectives on Climate and Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. This will be delivered by my colleague Orgo Sinha Roy, and Orgo has been working on disaster and climate resilience since 2003. He spent 8 years with the Asia Disaster Center and moved to ADB in 2012. So Orga, please let me hand over to you.
Thank you, Noel. I just want to confirm that you can see the slides. Okay.
Yes, Orgo, I can see the slides and we can hear you, although a little faint.
Thank you, Noel. I must confess my internet connection is a bit choppy, so if for some reason I drop off, I'll request my colleague Steve to step in, please. So thank Noel for the introduction, and welcome everybody for this virtual dialogue on resilient infrastructure. The purpose of this presentation is just to give a very quick overview and to introduce some of the emerging insights and perspectives required for making infrastructure resilient. We hope that this will be just a discussion starter, so please feel free to share your insights and views in the post, in the chat box, raise questions, but also provide answers of some of the issues which you might have already faced. We also think that some of the discussion that I will highlight will be taken forward in the subsequent webinar sessions. So the presentation looks at 3 aspects on the importance of resilient infrastructure, what are some of the emerging perspectives, and what are some of the opportunities. In terms of importance, we very well know that developing countries in Asia and the Pacific region suffer huge economic losses from extreme weather events and disasters triggered by natural hazards. These events impact infrastructure, assets, but also more importantly, the services and the functions that infrastructure provide. Now, the recurrent events such as these disasters are affecting the wider economy, but also reducing attractiveness of private investments in specific high-risk geographical areas or sectors. The losses from these events are expected to increase with climate change, both with the increase in extreme weather events, but also increase in temperature and precipitation changes, which are disrupting the functioning of infrastructure services and systems. Economic and financial impacts of climate change are already affecting countries' credit ratings, and the market has started pricing climate risk in its operations. ADB is undertaking a study looking at 30,000 assets in transport and energy infrastructure across Asia and the Pacific region. Some of the preliminary findings of the study shows that more than 50% of transport infrastructure are extremely at high risk from flooding, and more than 40% of energy infrastructure at high risk from water-related stress, which will affect their performance. We also know about the sea level rise, and some of the recent scientific research is showing that sea level rise is accelerating at a higher rate than what projected earlier. And this will have a huge impact on coastal infrastructure, specifically port, which globally handles about more than 80% of global merchandise trade. So with this increase in threats from climate and disaster risk, what are some of the emerging perspectives to strengthen resilience? First, the importance of understanding risk, and not just understanding risk of individual infrastructure assets, but the wider system in which a particular asset functions. And this is important because you look at the different parts of the system, its interrelationship between different assets, different stakeholders and institutions involved in managing different assets, and collectively to come up with solutions on how to manage such risk. In understanding risk, a key issue which one faces is about the uncertainties, and such uncertainties should be documented and transparently communicated to decision makers so that the decisions taken are much more risk informed. The next, looking at once we have a complete understanding of the risk, the importance of adopting different measures to deal with the risk, be it grey infrastructure or increasingly through nature-based solutions or green solutions. Of course, the solutions have to be cost effective and have to meet local priorities. And it's equally important to build local institutions, capacities, and standards and regulations so that such solutions are much more sustainable in the long run. It's also understood that making infrastructure resilient, the solutions need not always be in the infrastructure sector. Solutions could also be within the consumers and users of infrastructure. For example, in areas which are water scarcity, there could be important solutions promoting behavioral change among users to use water much more carefully. Last but not the least, we also know that we cannot reduce all risk. There will always be certain residual risk which needs to be managed through improved pre-disaster planning, including financial preparedness for disasters through disaster risk financing solutions. Thus, it's important that in this webinar series, we start looking at infrastructure solutions, as Noel highlighted, differently and ask the right questions which will help us understand what is required to make the systems much more resilient. Before ending, just to highlight a couple of opportunities, as Noel already mentioned, an estimates by ADB shows that there are huge infrastructure investments in the pipeline. It's expected that countries in Asia Pacific region will be investing 1.5 trillion per year between 2016 and 2030 to meet infrastructure needs. So of course, these investments provide huge opportunities to build resilience. Secondly, there are estimates showing the cost effectiveness of investing in resilience infrastructure. A publication by World Bank last year showed that a resilient infrastructure is cost effective, while the exact cost benefit ratio depends on a specific location, the hazards, and the infrastructure in case. However, broadly, $4 of benefits are earned from every $1 of investments. And these benefits also perform very well in the face of climate change. Similarly, last year, analysis undertaken by the Global Commission on Adaptation very clearly showed that investing 1.8 trillion globally in 5 areas, including making infrastructure resilient between 2020 and 2030, could generate 7.1 trillion in total net benefits. So the case of economics is clear. And last but not the least, we know countries are going through the current pandemic crisis and embarking on huge recovery efforts. And these recovery efforts will put in place systems, institutions, and assets which will last for decades. That is a huge opportunity for countries to ensure infrastructure resilience in the context of COVID-19 recovery. Just to conclude, essentially, we know that climate and disaster risk is increasing, and it's important to build infrastructure resilience for improving the performance of wider systems of our society. It's also important because it gives the right signal to the private sector for further investments in resilience. Secondly, it's not enough just to look at infrastructure assets by asset to make it resilient, but looking at the wider systems so that all the users and the beneficiaries of the system collectively approach towards building resilience. And third, a case for economics is clear. Investing in resilient infrastructure is cost effective, and there are many opportunities, including the current pandemic recovery, which can help us embark on a long path of making resilient infrastructure. I'll stop here, Noel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Urgo, for that comprehensive overview and also some of those very striking economic figures. Our second presenter today is Dave Brunston from the Kestrel Group in New Zealand. Dave is director of the Kestrel Group, which is a small New Zealand consultancy that provides strategic advice on the resilience of buildings and infrastructure and on emergency management issues. Dave is the principal engineer advisor to a range of national organisation and local authorities in New Zealand. He chairs the Ministry of Education's Engineering Strategy Group that provides technical oversight for the design and seismic assessment of school buildings. And he also advises the National Building Regulator on the implementation of the new regime for mitigating seismically vulnerable buildings. He's also the principal advisor to the New Zealand Lifeline Utilities Council. Dave is a Distinguished Fellow of Engineering New Zealand and life member of both the New Zealand Society for Earthquake Engineering and the Structural Engineering Society of New Zealand. He's also a member of the Australian Earthquake Engineering Society and the US Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, and of the Disaster Risk Management Committee of the World Federation of the Engineering Organizations. So Dave, thank you for joining us today and welcome.
Thanks, Noel, and hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to share some reflections on how the lessons from the infrastructure rebuild that we've been through in New Zealand following 2 major earthquakes over the past decade aligns with our pre-earthquake or business as usual approaches to infrastructure resilience. We define or frame infrastructure resilience with having 3 key elements in New Zealand. The first one is having robust physical assets, and that's the likes of buildings that are not vulnerable to water effects or seismic effects, as well as having networks that have alternative routes. And think of highways or transmission networks for electricity or gas, and making sure that if you, as far as possible, if you lose one in an event, then you at least have other redundant routes that the services can be delivered through. The second element is effective relationships, and that's both pre-event and post-event, having effective coordination of resilience activities before an event, and obviously coordination of a very intense set of activities after an event. And the third element is actually reflecting on the community and having end users that understand the fact that infrastructure is not always fully resilient, and that they have appropriate backup arrangements. That's particularly important for the likes of hospitals and critical facilities. So the key practice elements in New Zealand for infrastructure pre-event, resilience pre-event, is having collaborative interagency arrangements working together to share the knowledge and expertise that we have. It's obviously something we can do in a small country like New Zealand, but it still takes a lot of work. But the purpose of that is to identify mitigation opportunities across infrastructure providers to be able to share the approach where risks are in common. Think of highway bridges that are usually supporting up to 5 or 6 other utility services. And so therefore they are actually shared risks. But of course, doing this pre-event builds those critical relationships that can be drawn upon in the rebuild phase following a disaster. And here we're talking about both organizational relationships and individual relationships. And we had first-hand experience of those in our major events, the importance of having those relationships in place. Just a couple of snapshots. Firstly, our decade started with the Canterbury earthquakes, and the image that you see there is not flooding, it's actually liquefaction, water inundation in our residential areas, and that led to 4% of all the residential properties in a city of 500,000 being taken out of service as housing properties. Then later on in the decade, we had quite a different event, also in the South Island though, where the highways and the rail networks and the highways that run along our coastline were heavily impacted. You can see here the landslide. You can also just see what I'm pointing to. That was the rail track that was there. It got swept out to sea, almost literally. And that key arterial highway with not a lot of alternative routes were without a service for more than a year. So as we reflect on the rebuild lessons, and looking at them firstly through a technical lens, and things that we did for the highway and rail networks, when we replaced them, we designed them to current standards. That's something that's fairly important. And of course, at the same time, the benefit was that we were achieving a asset renewal more rapidly than would have been the case if we hadn't had the earthquake. Back to the household, the residential level, the many challenges in the liquefaction affected areas of Christchurch where they couldn't simply reinstate wastewater networks. And so they thought differently and introduced holding tanks at the individual property levels that were pumped into street mains that were no longer capable of working under gravity. Similarly, from Christchurch, the telecommunication networks, one of the many things that occurred when we had our central business district locked up because of the numbers of dangerous buildings is that the telcos couldn't get access to refuel the storage tanks for standby power generators. So now, after the earthquakes, they are being made much bigger in their capacity. Then we reflect on the organisational aspects and certainly how the rebuild was delivered after both events followed a change in thinking from both central and local government that needed to be, again, more collaborative and less controlling than customary contracts are. Equally, contractors recognise the delivery benefits in joining forces. And so what we developed principally for horizontal infrastructure was an incentivised alliance involving funders, typically the government agencies, network owners and contractors, all working together. And just to sum up, drawing all this together, it really just highlighted back to that point about relationships. I said earlier, the importance of them and the collaboration between organisations to take those common mitigation opportunities for everyday infrastructure resilience planning. And as we look beyond the earthquake backdrop to this story, climate change adaptation obviously requires careful collaboration. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Dave. And if I can invite participants, if you have particular questions, to please pop them into the chat. And while I'm waiting, I'd like to ask Dave that given the time that has passed since the earthquakes, how difficult has it been to maintain and build on efforts to see through longer term policy reforms? And what approaches have you taken to maintain momentum with that?
That's it's a very important challenge that we are currently facing. Some people think that when you have an awareness of an earthquake that the willingness and the funding follows, but again, the alliances that I mentioned, they suffered in their 4th and 5th years with a fall off in the allocation of the funds they were expecting because government moved towards other priorities. And all that we've been able to do is by we have our annual forum that's actually underway today here in New Zealand, where we get all the infrastructure providers, the network operators, with government agencies and our science community to actually keep working and sharing common programs. But again, now that our government budgets are under even greater duress thanks to COVID, we're quite anxious about our ability to maintain momentum.
Thanks, Dave. And that's obviously a challenge that we're going to be facing in every country across the globe now. A second question for you is, because you have the benefit of hindsight, what do you see as the main entry points for advancing resilient infrastructure solutions in the aftermath of a disaster, but also obviously in advance?
Certainly, and one of the key things that we did following the Canterbury earthquakes a decade ago was we'd already established relationships with international specialists in infrastructure, and we are such a small country that we knew we needed to involve them, and we brought them to New Zealand a month after the earthquakes to provide experience, inspiration, and guidance. And again, I just refer to that because because we involved them prior to the earthquakes, they already had quite a close working knowledge of New Zealand's infrastructure. We seconded them into a couple of key government agencies, as it happened, 3 or 4 years prior to the Canterbury earthquakes. And that's another little innovation that people with international mana can really make a difference if they're introduced the right way.
Thank you very much, Dave. I have one question. It's a great initiative from New Zealand. Okay, I think we've covered that question. I'm going to introduce the next speaker as more questions can be popped into the chat as we go along. So I'm very pleased today to have our next speaker from Thailand, Kachakorn Vorakom, is from the Porous City Network. Kun Koch is a landscape architect who works on building productive green public space that tackles climate change in urban, dense, and climate vulnerable communities. Her company won a contract to build Bangkok's first public park in 3 decades. And with this project, she created an 11-acre thirsty plot capable of absorbing 1 million gallons of water through a combination of slope gardens, wetlands, and a retention pond. Her company's also been involved in a 36-acre park featuring the biggest urban farming green roof in Asia that we're going to learn more about. So Kun Koch is featured in the 2019 Time 100 Next. This is a list of Time magazine that spotlights 100 rising stars who are shaping the future of the world. She's also listed on the 15 Women Fighting Against Climate Change. Kun Koch is chairwoman on the Landscape Without Border of International Federation of Landscape Architects in the Asia Pacific region. She's a TED Fellow, Echoing Green Climate Fellow, Atlantic Fellow, and she received her master's degree in landscape architect from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. So Kun Koch, we're delighted you're with us today, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Noah, and hi everyone from Bangkok, Thailand. I'm gonna share my screen right now. And from what Noah have mentioned about my profile, I think the one that I'm most proud of is did you see my screen? Yes. I think it's a 15 women leading the fight against climate change. That reason because I feel that climate change is not so much about infrastructure, but it is also about gender, justice, education, and many more. And I'm so proud to be woman from Southeast Asia working to do this in my homeland. This is Thailand, Bangkok. I'm sure many of you have visited, and we are like building this big patch of concrete on top of wetland or on top of delta land. And this is how flat we are, and you can see the ocean is not so far away. And imagine when the rain coming, where does it go? There's have no room for water. And this is what it feel like, even just 15 minutes of rainfall. So I'm actually, and yeah, sometimes you realize that the city is not only just for human, it's actually for many other creatures as well. And one time I was invited, feel very honored to be as part of the UN climate event as a keynote called NAP, National Adaptation Plan. And I was a little surprised, like why they invite landscape architects to talk to this government sector. And I just like presenting, and eventually I just find out that, wow, many developing countries, the money that they're getting from the NAP, the UN, or even from the Asian Development Banking, is just like, they go and build this thing. It's actually not a solution. For me, it's just a short-term solution. All this concrete infrastructure, it's just gonna last for like generations plus S. So I just feel that I'm wondering, like, this is the park I did, and you can see how concrete we are as a city on the background. And this is only 1 minute. So this park is actually the first one in 30 years. When I say 30 years, I'm talking about 20 million people city, not include another 20 million of tourists. And we are flat, we are monsoon country, and it's just like pouring rain that nonstop in the rainy season. And the sea level rise, so all the water is coming from all directions, like from the north, from the south, from the sky. So people mention, like, why don't you adapt like many other technique from Netherlands, from this developed country? And I say, yeah, it's such a very different condition in terms of ecologically, the cultural maintenance of the people, and we still keep building. Even we have a great flood on 2011, and we have so many like that we call natural change as natural disaster, we still keep building and building on the same problem. So this part is actually the message that I want to convey is actually like inclining, equipped with rainwater tank, have the wetland, have this retention pond. So when it's flood, it's actually double the size. So just the park itself designed to flood. And it's actually designed for the social event as well. And this is like with the park, with when it's with rain and with no rain. And I was very pleased to be welcome Mr. Antonio Guterres, who came last year to visit the park. It's a very big thing for us, for me as a local designer, that, oh wow, what I have done is actually like maybe the future of architecture. So this is what Noah mentioned about the biggest urban farming rooftop in Asia. Thinking about all this wet space in the city is our concrete rooftop, hiding all this infrastructure, look very ugly, is putting up there and actually create us heat, PM 2.5 and so many more. What if it can be turned into like the place for food? Right now, we all have problem from climate change or food security. So this infrastructure is actually solving the problem and solve many other problems as well. So what solution we invest shouldn't only just answer one problem. It should answer many. It's equipped with solar roof, it's equipped with this actually coming from the concept of rice services. I got 3 more minutes. So yeah, this is like the food, and I think Thailand and many other countries has so much problem about importing pesticides from a big company, and we're actually eating something that causes us cancer. So instead of like fixing only water issue, this building actually slowed down the runoff 20 times. So instead of like flooding right away to the city, like whole city, the concrete is actually help absorb like a monkey sheep, and actually holding this use of public green space. Yes, and this another project I'm working with the mayor of Bangkok and the urban design team called UDDC. We actually re-infrastructure the unused 40 years, this such a corrupt failed infrastructure 40 years ago, hiding in the city, and turn it into a place. Actually turning into the first park across the river in any capital of the world. We actually beat London, beat New York, because we already have an existing infrastructure. And then we reuse it into the pedestrian bridge for people to walk on. And I'm not saying that all this solution is for only those who have budget. I'm actually working for those vulnerable climate community, and actually telling them like they are so happy to get like 450 million baht for the dam. And I just like, no, you know what it's gonna cost you? It's actually gonna happen like this much with the flood, with the problem of the visual and the way they live. So I just feel that the porous city network is actually the thing that we used to encourage for the development for the sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kun Koch. Just fascinating developments, and so applicable to so many parts of the world. But also, I think the boldness of your vision is really the key aspect that strikes me. It's that to be so visionary and to bring together all of the players to make it happen. And I think I'm going to follow up with an immediate question on that. So this kind of innovation, it means introducing a new way and an unknown approach. So how have you how have you navigated the regulatory environments that within Thailand and that would have favored a business as usual approach?
I think it's actually something that the government and the city have to invest already, like as the first presentation, that we still have to keep ongoing maintenance our infrastructure. But I'm wondering, why don't we use those money to create a future city, a better city? That's something that we don't need to maintenance. When I say infrastructure, green infrastructure or natural-based solution, those infrastructure have life of its own. So you actually invest once and you keep growing with it. So I just feel like I want to shifting this thing, and it takes so much of effort to convince. And I'm sure, and all this project that's happened is actually really a good sign that the government, like especially in Bangkok or in Thailand, that something can happen so difficult and it's doable.
Immediate follow-on question to that. What approaches or what has been successful to maintain the political level commitment for these investments, and that they're made with multiple administrators and in an extremely complex political dynamic?
I would say it's very challenging, and in one project it takes so much time and so much energy. But I feel that as an agent of change and as someone who's not working in the government sector, is actually probably the part of how you become a landscape architect or urban designer or architect to actually talk to. So there's so much participatory process and dialogue about this project, and I think that is have to, like, you can't give up easily. And yes, I think the collaboration and dialogue is such an important key for all this success. Yes.
Thank you, Kunkoch. I would ask if you have more questions for Kunkoch to please pop them into the chat box, because we'll have an opportunity for further questions in a little bit. The next step is to actually the brainstorming session and to hear from our participants. So I want to bring you back to the link that was shared by Belinda. It's in the chat from earlier. Please, I hope you can find it. It was shared at 2:07. And now it's being shared again just now. So if double click on this, and you will see that you open a grid, a whiteboard grid. And we want to capture your thoughts. The subject for this conversation is what is needed to scale up resilient infrastructure investment in Asia and the Pacific. So on the whiteboard, you can see that there are 4 colored sections. They represent 4 areas: economic, social, institutional, and ecological. And each one of the small green squares or blue squares, pink or yellow squares are Post-it notes. And it's up to you. This is an opportunity for you to type your thoughts on the Post-it note. So we're going to give a 5-minute opportunity for this to happen. I know it's a very new tool for many of us. So please, we will be very grateful to get your views. You will see, Belinda's pointing to it, that there is an opportunity to stop seeing the cursors from everybody. This will allow you to pick on particular cursors. So you can see, Belinda, there's already some thoughts that are being popped in. So I'm going to be quiet now. If you have particular questions on this how this works, please pop them in the chat. Thank you. You've got a 5-minute allocation. Great. That's been a super quick response. Now I'm gonna try and read out some of those. I'm gonna ask my colleague Belinda to zoom in on the ecological thoughts. So I'm seeing here cost benefits. I'm seeing nature-based solutions and cost benefits of nature-based solutions. Guidelines on incorporating nature-based solutions, air quality improvement, financing models for nature-based solutions, incentives to move away from existing projects, and characterization of ecosystem services in rural areas and customized application in urban setting. And there's also reference to air pollution. So in terms of the physical aspects, I'm seeing the word planning. So integrating planning for infrastructure systems, linking with spatial planning. I'm seeing building codes and regulations to promote resilience as a core requirements. Again, standard building codes, urban energy systems, mini grids, building back better, updating building codes, enhance ability to enforce building codes, build to last for future conditions, not just current codes. And I'm totally in agreement with that, having been in a number of conversations on not just sea level rise but also the whole question of total sea levels with wave power and storm surges, everything that is included. Build worthwhile targeted redundancy and build it into key systems now. Design assets to work in a wider range of conditions. Design systems that are fail-safe, design assets and systems for rapid recovery after outages. So lots of great ideas there that we'll be collating. Another excellent response in the social and institutional aspects. I'm just going to pick on a few key points. I'm seeing the term community, community-led initiatives with public-private funding, and O&M support, operation and maintenance support. I'm again, engagement of communities, CSOs and private sector, also looking at local government capacity building, ensuring a people-centered approach, improve the resilience of organizations that support infrastructure. Understanding that infrastructure is a service rather than just the assets and the systems. So very key thought there. Capacity building for local people, making sure that data is available in local languages, getting community and user buy-in to the kind of transformational change that we're promoting. So then other areas about flood forecasting and early warning systems, as Kunkoch mentioned, the multi-stakeholder collaboration, leadership and long-term risk-reward thinking. Again, yeah, all very key points. I think Belinda will move into the last of the 4 zones. Can you move that? So in terms of the financial, so we need to value the intangibles better in the business cases. And we also need to reward organizations that prioritize community needs in investment decisions. I can see concessional finance that promotes, rewards resilient measures, looking at pricing of risk to enable the market to respond. And another point similar to that is risk-informed decision-making. We've also got the question of linking in the private sector, trying to make risk insurance or products available for local disaster, incentivizing, I've missed the flow of thought from. So it's pricing on risk, and then the risk-informed investment planning and incentivizing such approaches through tax breaks so that it can be scaled up. And optimizing financial management for project infrastructure. We also have a novel yellow posted on climate adaptation investment bonds. So I think that's been a great, successful, it's my first time using Mural. So a really interesting way to capture lots of feedback from the participants. I would ask you just if you had any problems with using Mural or have any recommendations for a similar exercise in the next event, please do pop it into the chat box because that will be our way of gathering your feedback. Okay, we're heading towards 3 o'clock already, and I want to come to our next speaker. We're joined by Mr. Seti Chen, who is the CEO for Tonga Power Limited. Seti is currently in New Zealand, but where he's joining us today. He's been involved in the power utility industry for over 17 years and has gained extensive experience in New Zealand before returning to Tonga in September 2012. Seti has been the CEO of Tonga Power Limited for 2 years, prior to which he was the general manager of operations, and he was also the network design and planning manager. So he's gained lots of experience. He commenced his professional career working with Electrics New Zealand as a transmission line engineer, leading into project management. And his involvement with projects spans over a wide range of network upgrades, rehabilitation, restoration, solar, and wind farm development, as well as battery energy storage systems, as Tonga moves to its goal of becoming 50% renewable. So thank you very much, Seti, for joining us, and welcome.
Oh, thank you very much, Noel, for the introductions, and malo lele, and good evening from New Zealand. It's certainly a pleasure to be part of this virtual dialogue on resilient infrastructure, and providing a perspective as one of the developing member countries. Just to give a brief background on Tonga's energy sector and the power utility in the context of this journey towards resilient infrastructure. The power company was owned by a private entity for about almost 10 years before it was finally bought back by the government in 2008, and thus establishing Tonga Power Limited, as we call it TPL, as a state-owned enterprise. We generate, we distribute, and retail electricity across all 4 island networks. Now, unfortunately, Tonga Power Limited was handed a distribution network asset that was in disrepair. It was very unsafe. It was unreliable, and in certain areas reaching end of life. Coupled with an aging network was a generation base that was 100% reliant on diesel. And as we all remember, the global financial crisis, or the GFC, happened in 2008. So it was a double whammy, so to speak, for Tonga Power, starting off with a tariff of around 1 pa'anga per kilowatt hour. And so this has been the highest tariff in Tonga since. And so in 2009, the government and TPL embarked on a process to develop an overall plan with the assistance of the development partners. Now, this brought to life the Tonga Energy Roadmap, which we call TERM, 2010 to 2020, which was a 10-year roadmap to reduce Tonga's vulnerability in oil price shocks. And it's meeting 50% of demand by way of renewable energy, and achieving an increase in safe and quality access to resilient energy infrastructure, obviously in an environmentally sustainable manner, and thus paving these network upgrade projects, which I'm about to talk about. So, as we all know, energy is fundamental and is a fundamental building block in any country's social and economic development, and in enhancing the livelihood and well-being of the people. And in the Pacific, we are prone to climatic events during the summer months, and when the power goes off, it affects all the businesses and every household. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides is just a few pictures of the devastations from major tropical cyclones that have impacted Tonga over the last 10 years. Next slide. And the next. So the Nuku'alofa Network Upgrade Project is the latest network upgrade project, and this picture just shows the state of the network. On the left is the state of the service lines and the poles. The picture in the middle is basically post-tropical cyclone Gita in 2018. Next slide. And so the World Risk Report in 2020 ranks Tonga as the second most vulnerable to disaster risk. And so in the middle of that circle is Tonga. And this is compared out of across 181 countries. And as you can see in the snippet of the number of cyclones from 2010 to 2018 that have crossed Tonga, that is a total of around 18 cyclones. So if we add, and this goes up to 2018 on that slide. If we add in 2019 and 2020 to that is an additional 6 tropical cyclones, 3 of which was this year, which was Tropical Cyclone Sarai, Tino, and the last one was Tropical Cyclone Harold. Next slide. And so with all of these network upgrades, we've had to ensure the project output and outcomes achieve the following. And so starting from the very top, increased resilience to climatic events, increased safety, the increased access to electricity, reduced line losses, and ultimately the reduction in tariff. Next slide. And so we went about looking at the network design and then adopted the aerial bundle conductor, or what we commonly known as ABC. And over the course of 9 years, we addressed lessons learned from the first upgrade projects to improve the resilience of the network, whereby now the Nuku'alofa Network Upgrade Project, we're installing both high voltage and low voltage aerial bundle conductor. We're replacing all the high voltage and low voltage poles. We're allowing for future growth and increased cable sizes. We've got more transformers being installed, new service lines and meter boxes. And so this addresses the volt drops, the technical and non-technical losses, thus increasing network efficiency and reliability. And so all of these infrastructure is being built and upgraded to Australian and New Zealand standards. So in essence, we've adopted the principles of building back better right through from 2011. Next slide. So the following next couple of slides are basically the transformation of the old network to the new on the right. And this is obviously proven to be cheaper when considering the long-term outcomes of both operational and maintenance. The restoration post-cyclonic events, it's much more safer. It's more reliable. It requires less tree clearing, pruning. It's more visually pleasing to the eye. It's less labor intensive, and it certainly requires less maintenance as well. But again, whilst we see the net transformation of the network, it's also important to note that part of the resilient infrastructure scope is also to build the capacity of the actual staff in itself to certified training, which we have successfully been able to conduct through New Zealand trainers, and at the same time incorporate gender inclusiveness to part of the labour forces. Where I'm certainly glad to say that we've got up to at least 16 to 17 line mechanics that are women, which is not a traditionally female-dominant industry. Next slide. And next one. Next. So this just gives you a timeline of the Tonga Energy Resilient Infrastructure starting from 2010. You see all the major hurricanes that have come through Tonga over the last 10 years, and the various projects that we have been able to benefit from, starting from the Tonga Village Network Upgrade Project in 2011, which was a grant funding from the government of New Zealand, and that stepped forward in through to TV NUP Stage 2 and 3. Then throughout some of the major hurricanes, like Tropical Cyclone Ian, which devastated the islands of Hawaii, we were able to start bringing in donor partners, assistance from the Asian Development Bank. And that's pretty much a step through the phases of being able to build back better. But at the same time, the resilience of the network as we've built it has meant that the restoration time for us, restoring power to our customers, have dropped from Tropical Cyclone Ian took us about just over 7 weeks. Tropical Cyclone Gita took us about 5 weeks for full restoration. And then the last one, Tropical Cyclone Harold, which took us only 4 days. So in total, we've been able to build a network infrastructure of just over 800 kilometers of LVABC, 86 kilometers of high voltage conductor, over 25,000 poles. Customer services of over 590 kilometers, and this has benefited over 18,000 customers. Next slide. And so in closing is the old adage, Rome wasn't built in a day, and this has been 10 years of full dedication from the team, and a couple more years to come as well. And it's significant, and the significant investment, and it has been a significant investment in order to climate-proof and transform the energy sector towards renewable energy dependence. So without the close collaboration between the government, Tonga Power Limited, and our development partners, Tonga wouldn't be in this position whereby we're now able to pretty much power the sustainable development of our kingdom. So with that being said, I'll just like to say thank you to everyone here, and I'll hand it back to you, Noel. Malo.
Thanks very much, Seti, and it's great to have you on board today. And I think for all the collaborative work together with the Pacific Department, I know we really appreciate all of your efforts. I have a couple of questions, actually one that's coming here, a technical question. Has there been any targeted high voltage undergrounding to go with the conversion to the LVABC?
Yeah, so post-tropical cyclone Gita, we have identified some of the areas within the CBD that that we will be undergrounding rather than going overhead with HVABC or LVABC. So it has been part of the lessons learned, identifying some of the key risk priority areas, particularly with essential services such as the hospital, telecommunications, the water board. Some of these areas we've looked at, we've identified, and we're going underground, just basically keeping that resilience up.
Yeah, and I know you've also shared with us all of the data from your the power network as part of the multi-hazard analysis that we're currently working on with Tonga. So I'm also looking forward to the learning that we're going to have out of that, particularly with the application of the sea level rise and the storm surge. So that's good. In terms of just another question direct for you, Seti. So recognizing the limited resources available and the need for a clear return on investment, how has Tonga Power Limited balanced risks with associated with introducing new or unfamiliar technology? And how has it been to get the buy-in for that?
That's certainly a good question. I think in terms of the design, the network design that we've installed, it's not something new to Tonga Power. We were actually one of the first Pacific Islands to have a pilot project of installing high voltage ABC and LV ABC as well. So I'm glad to say that we've just decommissioned that asset last year. So it's gone through several climatic events and have withstood all of those heavy forces. But at the same time, we did undertake a cost-benefit analysis comparing traditional aerial overhead 3-wire to aerial bundle design, and as I mentioned before, the prices are certainly coming a lot more competitive, where you are practically seeing it across the Pacific that's being installed, and it's not just a design that's being picked up by the Pacific. The places like France, the UK, Ireland, even in Australia, Melbourne specifically has got a lot of aerial bundle design. So it is certainly in the long term more beneficial.
Sorry, Seti. I have a couple of more questions. One is, you've been very successful with increasing female participation in the workforce. And I think the question is, have you achieved this? Has it been specifically targeted effort?
It would certainly be a combination of both, just putting out the awareness. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, traditionally some of these work is not commonly known to female participants joining in, and even in the technical side with regards to engineering. So it's always going to be a challenge for us. But I think what we have found out is just the having that gender inclusion right from the very start and just promoting the awareness. A lot more female are coming through that pathway, not just through high school, but also through the technical colleges, which we then pick up. They go through the same process as other line mechanics, but we are seeing a large number of involvement from our females coming into this industry.
Have to ask you, has it spread beyond Tonga Power with any of the other agencies?
I think we're benchmarked across the Pacific through the Pacific Power Association. So, not being biased, we'll probably have got the largest number of active line mechanics that are female currently standing right now. But I know that it is certainly a part of what we are supporting it through the Pacific Power Association as well.
Great. And the last question. So regulations can introduce new costs of doing business. So how has Tonga Power worked with the government or the regulator to ensure the right balance?
Again, good question there. So I think just to put things in perspective, without the donor funding projects or development partners providing investments into Tonga, we just wouldn't be in this position right now. Where if I look at our capital our capital for distribution over the last 5 years as part of our regulatory reset, this next reset for the next 5 years have effectively half that cost. So we've improved in our capex and also our opex as well. So that's setting a cheaper price for electricity. But certainly in terms of working through the regulator and promoting the designs that we've built, I think it certainly has proven, particularly in terms of restoration, where we've basically reduced the disruption time to businesses and households, and it's proven over the years. What we've seen in the last one with Tropical Cyclone Harold, it's only taken 4 days for the country to come back up to its feet, so economy gets back up and running.
Really significant. Thank you, Seti. I'm going to ask if give you a break for now. And if anybody has any questions for Seti, please post them into the chat box. I'm going to come back, Dave. I'm now welcoming questions for Dave or Kunkoch. Kunkoch, yeah, you're here. Great. I'm going to ask Dave a specific question. Dave, it's been a number of years since the big earthquakes, and you shared your insights with us. Can I ask you now, what are there aspects that you might have done differently? Are there aspects that you would have prepared better for prior to the earthquakes?
I think in terms of preparing change things, well, it's just considering whether the current location of all elements of infrastructure is appropriate. And of course, we know historically much of our infrastructure is was originally located in places that we probably wouldn't put them in now if we were to take a broader planning approach. And this probably talks to the notion sometimes of building back differently rather than just building back better in the same location. But in order to be able to do that in the grips of a crisis, you have to have done a bit of prior thinking. And the point I spoke to about setting up a incentivized alliance for post-earthquake work, there was quite a bit of thinking around how do we reinstate underground services in a liquefaction affected area that did lead to some building back differently. And I think that sends a bit of a pointer to we always need to be conscious of not just adding new infrastructure on top of existing infrastructure in the wrong place. That consideration usually has a fairly hefty price tag, but it's worth the process of thinking.
Sorry, Dave. I mean, this for me is a key point with so much of our work in the Pacific. And I would ask you, it's not always the technical actors that you need to bring on board with this. It's the higher level, the politicians. And I mean, from all the processes you've been part of, have you any insights to recommend to us on how to do this?
Well, again, I have been reflecting on the question from Augo in around the doing things differently, and probably we would have liked to have worked harder on our government agencies whilst we had their attention as the principal funders of our rebuild. But what we now have and recently established is a New Zealand Infrastructure Commission. And again, the focus of that commission is the planning of infrastructure upgrades, primarily with a view to economic development of the country. But of course, we always reflect that by mitigating to avoid certain aspects of damage in events, that's actually avoiding a negative economic impact, which is as important as promoting economic development going forward. But again, through the New Zealand Lifelines Council, we actually, for some 30 years, have had the ability to get key lifeline utilities together to think about mitigation together. And we have always been striving to get more government agencies in the room in that discussion. It's something we need to keep working on.
I can see Kunkoch nodding, but I'll share that same question with her. But I'm also going to ask Kunkoch, do you see uptake of similar initiatives in other Thai cities? So taking what you've done in Bangkok, where you've had close collaboration with the mayor, do you see this? Do you see interest developing from mayors and governors of the other cities or secondary cities, smaller towns, that are also at an earlier stage of their development? And what are the opportunities and challenges that you see specifically with the secondary cities?
Thank you for the questions. I think it's very relevant because if you know, Thailand is like everything is in Bangkok, and it's such a not like equity development in a way, because we all pay the same tax, but many developments have so focused on Bangkok. And yes, there is so much like a ground movement that designer collaborative with the communities and actually working with the government. I think there's so much to be done in the region, and many people approach from top down. But I feel that with the balance of bottom up, of course we need top down, definitely. But with the balance of the bottom up, I feel that it will kind of like the government will have a better decision or more balance in terms of the equity into the different group of people. And yes, I would say the initiative is actually started in Chiang Mai, in Khon Kaen, and maybe in Phuket. And I hope that they're doing faster than Bangkok, because it's a big city. When you want to move, like the government sector is actually giving more energy to that.
Kunkoch, on that particular point, have you seen particular opportunities for communities to play a role in supporting or maintaining these types of initiative, green infrastructure in those other cities that you've mentioned?
Definitely, because for the NBS or green infrastructure, if you cannot do it to make it affordable to all, there's no reason to do that, because it's not gonna impact enough to against the climate change or any change that we are confronting. So to make all this like rainwater or the water tank on all these things more affordable to those low income housing is such a need. And I just feel that it not necessarily have to be an expensive project. It should transfer in terms of design, in terms of material, and when there's enough demand, all these costs will like go like affordable. Yes.
Thank you. I just realized we've just got 8 minutes left, and I would like to give the opportunity for the second poll. So Sugar Gonzalez, can I ask you to come in with this second poll? Okay, so the second poll is, which topic is of most interest to you for future webinars? We've got disaster recovery, building back better, resilient infrastructure standard, nature-based solutions, resilient operations and maintenance, and economic analysis for infrastructure resilience. So just give you another 5 or so seconds if you can respond to the poll. Okay, great. So all 5 topics are certainly of interest. Lead responding is in terms of the economic analysis for infrastructure resilience. So we'll bring that into our learning for the next events. So I have one last question, and I think it's coming in regard to Tajikistan that I'm going to paste. We're currently undertaking a study in Tajikistan to estimate the full costs of disruption caused by disasters affecting the road networks. The aim is to provide the evidence to support a call for greater investment in network resilience. It's not yet clear that this will work to convince senior politicians. So have other similar studies been undertaken? And if so, were they successful in changing the government priorities? And what is the trick to achieving this? So I think that's probably not a question that is directed to anyone in particular, but maybe I'm going to ask Seti as first to just come in and say, Seti, from the perspectives of Tonga, are there any particular points that you would recommend when dealing with politicians on this kind of change?
Yeah, I guess probably just in the context of the Pacific, it's I mean, again, it depends on the structure of your network. You know, if you've already come in into the company where you've got continuous blackouts and brownouts, and then you've got a price of electricity that is very high. The directors are obviously from government. That at the end of the day, once you've built the project, they see the benefits filtering through the tariff. So I think for us, it has been very challenging over the last 10 years. There will always be that political push to see the benefits draw down on tariffs. So it is quite a challenging question to answer. But I think at the end of the day, when governments see the benefits pull through, particularly on disaster events and how fast you bring the economy back up, it pretty much represents itself in terms of how important that infrastructure is. And so that economic development, as fast as you can bring it back up, particularly at a time right now, it's very important and essential that government does see that and encourages it. So that is that's what we're having right now, government, that they do fully support the initiatives that we're doing in building the infrastructure.
Thanks very much, Seti. And in a way, Tom, you've been able to demonstrate this return on the investment in a very short period of time by the sheer number of tropical cyclones that Tonga has had to deal with. So you can see those returns quickly. I'm just going to ask Dave if you have got any final words of wisdom that you want to share.
Just quickly on that question, Noel, in New Zealand, we've developed an economic modelling tool which enables the impacts on several different infrastructure providers to be drawn into one model. And in our capital city, we've done this across a number of the infrastructure providers to demonstrate the benefits of integrating mitigation. We are in the process of putting that in towards government, so I can't answer the second part of the question about its degree of success. But having a tool like that, which again reflects indirect impacts on the community, not just direct physical impacts, seems to be one of the keys.
Kunkoch, last thoughts from you?
I think for the national-based solution, we actually aim to benefit many aspects. And I know that you probably want to build the road, or maybe in my case, it's like we want to restore the canal. But for government, canal is a sewage way. They don't think about transportation. They don't think about public space. So I just feel that to convince one department or even a politics is have to be integrative with many sector of the government to work together. So one solution, same budget, you actually can answer many benefit in many aspects. And I think that's a very convinced way and the benefit of natural-based solution.
There's lots of other questions we will have. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to engage again. I'm going to say right now a huge thank you on behalf of ADB and the team with SDCD who've put loads of work into organizing today's virtual session. So thank you very much. We have 2 further virtual dialogues that will take place in 2020. One in November, which will be assessing assessing climate and disaster risks of infrastructure systems. And a second in November, which will be measures for strengthening resilience of infrastructure. So please register via the website for these events. And then there will be a further series of events which will be scheduled throughout 2021. Thank you so much for your participation. And again, thank you to the presenters. Much appreciated your contribution, your time. And the next event is on the 11th of November. So please do register. You can see in the chat box the link for the registration. And if you have any thoughts, I think does the chat on Zoom remain live for some time after the meeting? I don't know. I know with Microsoft Teams, the chat does remain for a long time. So please do contribute further thoughts. And it's a big round of applause. Thank you very much to everybody. And wishing you, those in the Pacific, New Zealand, have a great evening. Good night, and good evening from Manila. And I guess for those of you who are farther west, have a good day. Much appreciated. Thanks.
Thanks, Noel.